So good morning, everyone. Good morning. When Carissa prayed, she said something nice, didn't she? She thanked Jesus for coming and showing us the way. And that's absolutely right, but we often ignore the fact as Christians that the way Jesus showed us was horrible. We're doing a series called 7 Things I Wish Jesus Never Said. Things that are so ridiculous, so absurd, that they make you wonder whether or not Christianity might not be the worst idea ever. Last week, Jesus said to his followers that they should not resist a person who's evil. This week he says something worse. This week Jesus has the audacity to say to people like you and me, who've been treated the way we've been treated, that we should love our enemies. Right? You get it. Now, just before we look into this particular absurdity, let's take a step back from it and bother to examine the context. In Matthew chapter 5, Jesus is preaching a sermon. And he's preaching that sermon outside, in the country, to country people. Jesus came from a part of Israel called Galilee. Most of his early followers were also from Galilee. So much of the action in the Gospels takes place in Galilee. And in first century Galilee, it's pretty much an agrarian society. So the economic base is agrarian. The majority of the population make its living off the land. They're either farmers or they're fishermen. Not in a big scale, just a small scale. All of Jesus' audience are small farmers or small fishermen. Just, salt of the earth, blue collar, pickup driving, dungaree wearing people. The kind of people who get flustered at the fancy menu in Starbucks. And in the first century, these down-to-earth, honest-to-goodness country people hated the pinstripe-wearing bankers who lived in the big cities. And they hated them for good reason. In Galilee, at the time of Jesus, there are 2 cities, 2 big cities. They're both new. The largest is the city of Sepphoris. It's built around the year 4 AD. The other one is the city of Tiberias, built around the year 19 AD. So 2 cities, both of them large, both of them lavish, both of them built within the lifetime of Jesus. Now, when the government, in their generosity, decide to build a new fancy city, whose money does the government spend? Right. Doesn't it, I'm not being political here, in case the government are watching. But doesn't it annoy you when you drive down a new road and there's a sign on the road that had to be bought? And the sign says, this project was funded by the government of Ontario. Not really. It was funded by the taxpayers of Ontario, both the road and the sign. Governments, we all know, don't have any money at all. The only money that governments have is money that they raise in taxation from people. So in the lifetime of Jesus, on 2 occasions, when Jesus is a young boy and when Jesus is a teenager, the government, in their generosity and wisdom, decide to build 2 world-class cities with all of their associated infrastructures and so on. And they pay for these projects by hiking the taxes of the pickup driving, dungaree wearing farmers and fishermen of Galilee. And then what happens, as soon as you build a new fancy city, you attract new fancy people. The sort of people who know how the system works. People who understand commodities and liquidities and leverages and all the other mumbo-jumbo of the markets. And these macchiato suit-wearing slicks set about acquiring the Galilee's agricultural economic base, its farming and its fishing. So it works something like this. All of the people Jesus knew in first century Galilee would own anywhere from 6 to 16 acres of land. And whatever they could grow on that acreage was their sole source of income. So not that much. And then when you throw in some weather variables and a high rate of taxation, 85% in Jesus' day, that's a tough go. That's a tough go. So tough that there were years when all of Jesus' friends just didn't make it. There was never enough to go around. And in those years when the farmers weren't making it, the money people from the city were on hand to help. In the form of a loan. A loan that they knew full well would go into default. And when it inevitably did, the suit-wearing slicks from the city ended up owning the land. So by the time Jesus is an adult, the situation in Galilee is that 0.5% of the non-indigenous Galilean population had acquired 99.5% of the Galilean wealth. Families that for generations had traditionally owned and worked their own land ended up working as subsistence labourers on large super estates owned by bankers in the city. This is why so many stories in the Gospels are written the way they are written. And these landlords in the city, they took everything from the poor. Everything. Have a look at this next slide. This was written by a first century doctor called Galen. Galen was very interested in the difference in health between people who lived in the city and people who lived in the countryside. He said, the city people, who as is customary store up enough food in summer to last the whole year, take all the wheat from the fields together with the barley, beans and lentils, so the city stunk. Okay, thank you. But they leave for the country people nothing but the remaining pulses. The country people, when they have used up their winter supplies, have only unhealthy nourishment, namely the shoots of plants, so grass. So for reasons you can understand, in Jesus' world, the people who lived in the country hated, absolutely hated, the fancy, wealth-owning people who lived in the city. When in the mid-60s of the first century, 30 years after Jesus' death, the country people eventually rebelled against the system, the first thing they did was go to the cities and burn them. Because in the cities, that's where the tax records are kept. They actually stormed the CRA and burnt it to the ground.
Let's go.
To the people watching this online, I do not approve of that. And to understand almost all of the gospel stories, particularly the ones that come from Galilee, you have to first of all understand that for the hard-working, blue-collar guy who lives in a small town in the country, life isn't just hard, it's unfair. And that unfairness is caused directly by the greedy people who live in the cities and by the religious establishment that supports them. Now, question, in the Gospels, who does Jesus hang out with all the time? Country people. Country people. Where in the Gospels does Jesus never, ever go? Sepphoris and Tiberias. Do you know where Sepphoris is? 4 miles from Nazareth. It's the city of Galilee. Jesus never goes there. Tons of the Gospel stories take place in the vicinity of Tiberias, that beautiful city. Never once is Jesus said to have set foot upon its sandstone streets. This is because in the Gospel there's a country bias. Jesus spends his time in the country with country people talking a language that they understand and relate to. And to those people, in this sermon, in the countryside, Jesus is talking to people who've been cheated out of their land. He's talking to people who are forced in winter to eat the shoots of plants, whatever that is, grass, no doubt. People who are being made to fund the lifestyles of the rich. Jesus says this, "You have heard that it was said, 'Love your neighbour and hate your enemy.'" So as we've seen in previous weeks, Jesus is talking to his audience and he knows what they've already heard. And here he references a very old piece of biblical teaching. Have a look at this next slide. So this comes from a part of the Bible called the book of Leviticus, great bedtime reading. And it says, "Do not seek revenge or bear a grudge against anyone among your people, but love your neighbour as yourself." So this is a law in the Bible, and it's a law that comes from a time when people lived in agricultural communities. So you would live over there in your 6 acres, and I live over here in my 6 acres, and that's how the whole village is. We all live and work in our own 6 acres. And in that kind of environment, it just makes sense, socially, evolutionary, call it what you will, that we all get along. It makes sense that we don't hold grudges, that we help one another out wherever we have to. For example, have a look at this. This comes from another part of the Bible, the book of Exodus, and it's a law as well. And it says, "If you come across your enemy's ox or donkey wandering off, be sure to return it. Be the nice guy. If you see the donkey of someone who hates you fallen down under its load, do not leave it there, but be sure to help them with it." And you can see how in a small community of small agricultural holdings, that just makes sense. I might not like you, you might not like me, our conversations might always be adversarial, but nonetheless, we're all in this together, we're paisan, I work your 6 acres, you work my 6 acres. Most of my clothes come from Walmart, most of your clothes come from Walmart. At the end of the day, your hands are just as dirty and calloused as mine are. And it's just not in either of our interests for us not to get along. And so if your donkey wanders off, I'm going to help you find it. Do you know why? Because one day my donkey might wander off and I'm going to need help. If your ox, I don't know, gets into ox trouble, I'm going to help your ox get out of ox trouble. Because one day my ox might be in ox trouble and I might need you to help me as well. This just makes sense. No problem with any of this so far. Have a look at this. This comes from a Jewish book called The Wisdom of Sirach. And it says, "Do not become an enemy instead of a friend." This is what we today call the wisdom of the marketplace, the power of the schmooze. If you're good at making friends and keeping friends, that will do you no harm whatsoever. This is why today people use social networking to further their careers and push their products. This is why most of the work done at trade shows and conferences is the work of networking. This is why in business sometimes it pays to be good at golf and fluent at the social niceties, because friends help friends. People do business with people they like. People help people they like. This is obvious. At this point we're reading the Bible and we're like, yes, the wisdom of the Bible is wise. I agree, I'm with it, no problem. So, if you have a choice to make an enemy or a friend, make a friend. So, the idea of loving your neighbour as yourself comes from this world. The world where social interdependency is everything. You never know when you'll need help. My neighbour and I, we're both similar people, doing similar jobs, pushing similar products, and we need one another. So love your neighbour, love your neighbour, love your neighbour. Be good to the people in your network. Be friendly to the people on your friends lists. It all makes sense. But that's not the only thing in the Bible. There's fun bits too. So, in the same period where the Bible is telling people to love their neighbour, those same bits of the Bible are saying things like this. Next slide. Talking now not about neighbours or friends or business acquaintances. We're talking now about people we don't like. people we hate, people who are outsiders. And it says them, you must destroy them totally. Yes! This is better. Make no treaty with them. I wasn't gonna. Show them no mercy. After all, those people, they're not like us. They're outsiders. They're not working in similar businesses, doing similar jobs. Therefore, they can't help me. In fact, they're against me. They're standing in my way. They're stopping me putting bread on my table. And so in the ancient world, the most pressing question in any moral discussion was who's who? Who's my neighbour, because them I have to like and love and be nice to? And who's not my neighbour? Who's my enemy? Who's my adversary? Who's against me? Because the Bible gives me a lot of latitude in being nasty and destructive towards them. Great. No problem. Which I think is... I'm okay with hate. Don't laugh. And don't laugh when I say don't laugh. Right? Hate. When we talk about hate, we're not talking about something abstract. We're talking about an event in your past, really. And when we talk about the people you hate, we're talking about the things those people did to you, about the ways in which those people have treated you. And your hate of them is justified, is it not? You are right to hate. So in Galilee, in Jesus' audience in the countryside that day, I know who everyone is. I know who my neighbours are, who I must love. They drive a pickup like I do. They wear Walmart dungarees like I do. They're blue collar just like I am. Their hands have got calluses on them just like mine do. And every day we do the same things together. We help one another. We support one another. We lend to one another without interest. We borrow from one another without shame. This is what we do. We're the salt of the earth. We're just blue collar workers. And we have to be that way. Because our land was taken from us by those men in the city with their suits and their banks. They're the enemy. And we hate them. And we hate them with good reason. There's a line in the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's a beautiful line. It comes from a part of the scrolls where new members of the community are taught the vows that they have to recite before they join the community. And one of the vows that new members of the community had to recite was, "We promise to hate the children of darkness." We don't have vows as a church, but if we did, we definitely want to include a line like that. We promise as members of this church to hate the right people. Yes. And as I suggested a moment ago, this hatred of the other is good. It's necessary. There are times in life when you need to hate. I didn't really like a lot of the whole Occupy thing. Remember that a few years ago? Where the 99% said, nah, I don't like the 1% anymore. But as a lover of history, I viewed those protests with a certain fascination because, of course, I've seen it before hundreds of times. One of the things that history teaches us is that people will only take so much inequality. Eventually, the poor and the trodden on rise up and say, no, that's enough. You're not doing this anymore. And we're fools to think that these things won't happen again. Have a look at this photo. So this photo was taken in Athens in the early 2000s. You'll perhaps remember the story. The Greek economy following the Athens Olympics went into total meltdown. And part of the reason that it went into meltdown is because the Greek government spent $15 billion building elaborate building projects for the 2004 Athens Olympics. And because they spent too much money, money they didn't have, they needed to raise money. And when the government needs to raise money, the first place they go often is the poor. So they said to people in Greece, we're going to cut your jobs, we're going to take away your services, and we're going to raise your taxes. And these people in this photograph are like, no, I wasn't invited to any meeting where it was decided we would spend $15 billion building fancy stadiums for the Olympics, so why should I pay for it? And so I'm rightly protesting about this. And this is just history repeating itself. It happens in every century, from the ancient world to the modern. Now, one of the big heroes of first century Galilee was a man called Hezekiah the Bandit. Great name. He was like a Jewish Robin Hood. His view on life was, I was a farmer until like last year. And my father was a farmer, and my grandfather was a farmer. We're from a long line of farmers. But I just can't do this anymore. The bank has taken away my land. The loan sharks, I can't even pay the interest for the loan that they gave me after they stole the money. None of this makes any sense to me anymore. None of it. I think a life of crime beckons for me. And from all over Galilee, people flocked to Hezekiah the Bandit's cause to learn the noble art of highway robbery. Kids had posters of Hezekiah the Bandit in their bedrooms. I mean, this guy was a hero in Jesus' audience. Good for him. Good for him. He's sticking it to the man. So when Jesus says to this crowd of country people in Galilee, you've heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. They knew where everyone was. Their neighbor was the landless poor. Their enemy was the landed rich. And they knew exactly how that enemy should be treated. So imagine their reaction when Jesus says, but I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. When we're 5 in church, that sentence makes sense. But when you're 45 in the real world, it's offensive. To seek the good of those who harm me, it's just wrong. And to make the offence of this worse, look at how Jesus goes on to justify it. At least here he does justify it. At least here he does bother to explain it to his followers. He says, when you love your enemies, when you seek the good of those who persecute you, you may be the children of your Father in heaven. That is, you will bear a resemblance to God. And then look at the next sentence. The God who causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. So in speaking to a group of good, honest to goodness, country people, Jesus again uses the language of agriculture, and he uses it in a horrible way. He says, you may have noticed, folks, that God in whom you believe makes the crops grow on the land of the banker who owns the large super estate that he stole from you and your friends. You may have noticed that the sun shines on his fields and the rain falls on his fields and stuff grows. That God should be that way, of course, raises all sorts of questions that we don't want to ask. Like, why do good things happen to bad people? Is it that God is all-powerful, but that he doesn't care about what bad people do and so he does nothing? Or is it that he's not all-powerful and that he can't do anything about what bad people are doing? Those are the questions. The answers are all horrible. But Jesus doesn't even get into it. Aside from saying this is how God works, He's good to the bad, He's good to the bad, He just leaves it there. But He asks His followers to be the same. These are people who've actually been hurt. Love those people who hurt you. Pray for the good of those who've persecuted you. Then He says, if you love those who love you, what reward will you get? Are not even tax collectors doing that? So at this point He's asking them to think about the very people who've stolen their land. And He says, think about it. Those people might be horrible people, but even horrible people have friends. Even horrible people have people that they get along with and they're nice to. It's a normal convention of human life that somebody likes somebody. But from the point of view of the gospel, those conventions are inadequate. To just love the people who you get along with isn't enough if you want to be Christian. To be Christian, you have to be exceptional, He seems to be saying. He says, if you greet your own people, what are you doing more than others? Do not even the pagans do that? In the ancient world, to talk about greeting someone was to talk about something very specific. It was to walk up to a person you met in the street and to wish them peace and prosperity and happiness. I vote no. You see, here I am, I'm walking around Walmart, worried about whether or not I can pay for what's in my cart when I get to the checkout. And who do I see walking up the aisle towards me but the guy who's put me in that very position? And now you want me to say to that guy, I wish you well. I wish you prosperity and happiness. I vote no. But my vote makes me ordinary. It requires nothing of me. Jesus is a bit more demanding. Then we get to the punchline. Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. Okay. Jesus, I can't even live up to my own standards. And they're low. The word perfect that He uses there, what is it? You're making a salad. And you've got a certain kind of tomato in mind for your salad. So you go to Garden Foods and they're all there. There's the wee yellow ones and the wee red ones and the dark ones that they've genetically modified, and there's the big red ones and the big red ones on vines, and you touch them all with your grubby hands and you look at them all and you find the tomato that you think will go with your salad perfectly, the tomato that fits the job. This is the word perfect that Jesus uses here. It doesn't mean perfect as in morally perfect, it means perfect as in right for the job, which of course is worse. You want to be right for the job of following Jesus in this world? Be nice to the people who are not nice to you. Seek the good of the people who have sought your harm. Now, what preachers normally do now, at this point, is they then explain that in such a way that means you don't have to do what Jesus actually said. I don't have an explanation. I just have an objection. And so do you. So let's just leave the awkwardness hanging there, because it's meant to be awkward. Let's leave the difficulty fresh in our minds and take it into the week. Try and work it out. Love your enemies. seek the good of those who've sought your harm. Good luck. Any questions? So, Jesus, at this point of the sermon, he says, remember, he says to his followers, unless your righteousness is better than that of the Pharisees, who are super righteous, you won't get into heaven. So when Jesus says this, his followers are like, what? And then Jesus explains it. And his explanation doesn't make it better, it makes it worse. So yes, in all these things we wish Jesus didn't say, he's saying things that are truly exceptional and that would make us exceptional. He actually explicitly says that. If you just are nice to the people who are nice to you, well, big deal. Okay? Everyone's like that. Being a Christian is different. Here's how. And it would be less than honest if we said that difference was palatable. That reminds me, did you hear what happened in the news this week? There was a group of religious fundamentalists in America built a Noah's Ark theme park. And this week it was destroyed in a flood. I'm serious. That was good. Yes, so that's an honest response to what Jesus is asking us to do here. Jesus is asking us to love our enemies. And we'd be less than human if we didn't put up our hands and say, well, yeah, don't you say a whole bunch of nasty stuff in the Bible? Like, shall we even talk about hell? And all of the objections that we would rightly raise to what Jesus says here are brilliant ways of getting out of what Jesus asks us to do. I will do anything. I will do everything. I will indulge in all sorts of verbal gymnastics, which are the only kind I can indulge in, to get out of doing what Jesus wants me to do. And the success with which I get out of those things makes me ordinary, not exceptional. I don't share the public sycophancy about Mother Teresa. I'm ashamed to say I agree with Christopher Hitchens' assessment of her that she was a poison Albanian dwarf. And I'll tell you why. Because she never actually sought to improve the lot of the poor. Her view was, let's leave them poor, let's leave them suffering, let's not make anyone better. In their poverty, we can find some kind of spirituality. And we would have, as readers of the gospel, to read that and say, that's not just wrong, that's grotesque. You're not making anyone's lot better, you're not improving anyone's life.
But isn't Jesus doing kind of this?
Okay, so in Jesus' day, the question is the same for everyone, and that is, how do we work our way out of this system that is fundamentally corrupt? It's keeping us where we are. Everyone's asking this question. The majority of Jesus' followers, in the bigger group at least, and the majority of the Galilean population, believed the answer was somehow violent, and that's the road they went down. So in 66 AD, they really went for it. And most of them ended up dead. Jesus attacks the system. To say that Jesus doesn't attack the system is completely wrong. And this is why he was killed. The thing that holds the system together in first century Israel is the temple. Everything revolves around the temple. And the temple in first century Israel isn't just a place of religion, it's a place of finance. The temple is the central bank of first century Israel. Jesus walks into the temple and talks about destroying it in 3 days and rebuilding it. He was talking about something else, but he used this language of this system is wrong. Taking down the system. And that, from their human level, was why they killed him. He attacked this. He threatened everything that made them rich and powerful. He just went about it in a different way. And whether that's the case or not, that's certainly the way that Jesus has been viewed historically. So people have taken inspiration from Jesus as he's almost like a non-aggressive revolutionary from a certain point of view. So Gandhi, for example, finds inspiration in Jesus. People would use words like Jesus and Che Guevara in the same sentences. There is something subversive about Jesus, more subversive than the sword. Jesus talks about ideas, different ones, dangerous ones, and those ideas got him killed. So certainly it's a historical mistake to look at the Gospels and say Jesus was like Mother Teresa because he just told the poor to stay poor and accept their lot in life. If that were the case, if Jesus said that, he would have been taken into the temple and made a partner, right, in the scam. Because he was saying the thing that everyone, all the rich love to hear. Stay poor, it's no big deal. If Jesus said that, that's what would have happened. Way out of time. Gotta go. Thanks.